Our top story today, the Right2Know campaign says that the way is now open for people to be charged with arms deal corruption. Civil organizations, Right2Know and Corruption Watch, argued that Judge Willie Seriti in 2016's findings misled the public by exonerating individuals who were involved in alleged corruption in the arms deal. Today, the Gauteng North High Court ruled in favour of an application to review and set aside the findings of the Seriti Commission of Inquiry into the controversial arms deal.
The findings of first respondent, issued and published in a report released to the fifth respondent on 30 December 2015 and made available to the public on 21 April 2016, are hereby reviewed and set aside. The fourth, fifth, sixth and seventh respondents are ordered to pay the costs of the applicants, including the cost of 3 counsel, which were incurred until the withdrawal of the fourth to seventh respondents of their opposition to the application. I hand down the judgment.
I agree.
I agree.
Well, joining us now is SABC journalist Njanji Chauke. He's covered a lot of this arms deal case extensively over time. And Njanji, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Yet another chapter. I mean, this is a long story. And I remember when this started, it almost from the get-go, there was already controversy.
Yes, there was big controversy when this arms deal started back. You know, it was established back in 2011. It took quite some time for it to get off the ground. We remember those hearings started in 2013. And as it started, we saw a number of people already starting to resign, some of the evidence leaders. You'll recall that also there were 3 commissioners at first, but one of them, as the commission started, jumped ship. So throughout the commission, we only had the 2 commissioners sitting throughout to hear the evidence.
So what the judge said in his finding is that crucial bits of evidence were ignored. And that was something that was raised at the time. I even believe there was volumes of information in a warehouse at one stage that they just refused to consider.
Yeah, they're saying that there are some documents that were not even looked at, critical evidence that was given to the commission, some from overseas that they were given. Here is the evidence, but that evidence was not even looked at. But another critical issue that the applicants are raising here is that some of the people that came to testify there, they were not asked probing or relevant questions, you know. So those are some of the critical issues that are being raised.
So questions will be raised now, because at the time it was called a whitewash. Was this done deliberately, or was it just a poor job?
I think this, because a lot of people are saying that in this inquiry there was a lot of political interference, you know, there was a lot of political interference. But it's very difficult at this stage because, you know, the judge, we have not seen any statement coming from, or maybe even the Judicial Services Commission or from the office of the judge concerned, because someone really has to speak for themselves. But I remember then when I was covering these hearings, there was a lot of talk about a lot of political interference and also about some information that was probably going to be swept under the carpet.
This same case was probed overseas, wasn't it? And the judge found it strange that no one from overseas was called to account.
Yes, no one was called from overseas to come and account, or even the witnesses that were called to come and testify there were not asked probing questions, meaning that the evidence provided in paper was not really tested. So hence some of the hence now they're saying this commission was a whitewash. You'll recall that some of the whistleblowers, actually the first the commission was based on what we call the Delil dossier. The minister, who's now the minister, Patricia Delil, submitted that dossier. Then we had whistleblowers like Terry Crawford Brown. We spoke to him today. There were a series of witnesses that were called from Corruption Watch, Andrew Feinstein, who is now based in the UK, and also some of the arms suppliers. You'll know there's also a relationship between the arms deal and the case that we have seen happening in Pietermaritzburg involving the former president Jacob Zuma, involving an arms, a French arms company. So those dynamics also playing out there.
So one of the things I think that the former president wanted to do was use the findings of the inquiry as part of his defense. That's going to be difficult for him now.
It's going to be difficult. Obviously, this is having implications on the case that we've seen playing out in Pietermaritzburg. But people also saying that the outcome of today's court has certain political implications as well. What needs to happen? Peter, you'll recall that the arms deal, when it was first conceived, it happened during the era of Nelson Mandela. If you can read the paperwork and all that, then we had the former president Thabo Mbeki, and then we had former president Jacob Zuma. So who is really going to be charged, and by who? Is the National Prosecuting Authority going to charge some of these people that are still alive, living with us here, or how are they going to handle the matter?
Do we have any idea what's going to happen now? I mean, you know, this inquiry took 4 years, cost hundreds of millions of rand. Do we start again, or what do we do?
I think what's going to happen now, if they really want to charge anyone, they'll probably be handing some of the evidence that has been provided to the National Prosecuting Authority, and from there, because I don't see them starting another commission. A lot of money went to waste, as you can see, as per the outcome of this court hearing.
Yeah, you mentioned a number of voices, Andrew Feinstein. There were other characters, if I remember correctly. Can you remember who some of the key figures that came forward to testify and leave their 2 cents worth?
Yes, some of the main people there were people like Fanahlongwane, who was the so-called middleman. You'll remember that Fanahlongwane back then was the consultant. He was this intermediary between these arms companies and the South African government. That middleman who is reported to have made millions of rand.
And these fees allegedly were not unusual.
Yes. We saw the former president Thabo Mbeki coming to testify there, saying exactly that it was not unusual for consultants to charge exorbitant amounts of money.
All right, well, we'll see how this next chapter unfolds, but certainly a significant ruling today, and we'll see what happens next. And Njanji, thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we're going to get more reaction on this, and we're now joined via Skype from the UK by former ANC Member of Parliament, Andrew Feinstein. Mr. Feinstein, thanks very much indeed for joining us. I suppose in some ways you feel a little vindicated and not surprised by the ultimate judgment.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be talking to you. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that this isn't about personal vindication for me or anyone else. I think that today's decision is really a tribute to South African civil society, particularly the Right2Know Campaign and Corruption Watch, who led this legal review. But it's also a credit to the South African judiciary, because with this legal review, what the judiciary is saying is that if you try and use commissions of inquiry, judicial commissions of inquiry, to cover up corruption, it's not going to work. And I think that's incredibly important for South Africa. And that, for me, is the key significance of this judgment.
In the main, which were the compelling evidence, do you think, that was ignored and really should have given the Seriti Commission different conclusions?
I think there was a plethora of evidence. We, for instance, when I say we, myself and my colleagues, Paul Holden and Henny van Vuren, submitted dozens and dozens of evidentiary documents to the Commission. These included, for instance, company minutes from one of the German defense companies in which they acknowledged being asked for a bribe by the head of procurement in the South African National Defence Force at the time. They acknowledged that they decided to pay the bribe, and they even mentioned the company in Liberia to which the bribe was paid. So the judge Judge Seriti decided in his wisdom that these sorts of documents could not be admitted into evidence as they had the status of stolen documents. Now, quite clearly, this would put an end to any form of investigative journalism, any form of meaningful judicial investigation. So I think documents like that are extremely important, and the Commission chose simply to ignore them. The warehouse of documents that you spoke about, that the NPA had made the Commission aware of was available, the Commission didn't even bother to look at them. So I think the reality of the South African arms deal is that for many, many years now, there has been an overwhelming amount of evidence of corruption in the deal. And in this instance, the Seriti Commission decided to completely ignore that sort of evidence. And I would now hope that today's judgment compels the National Prosecuting Authority to investigate further and to bring to account all of those. And when I say all of those, I mean both prominent South Africans, some of whom you've mentioned, but also the international arms companies, because of course when bribes are paid, there are two parties, those who pay and those who receive. And it is now my hope that all of this evidence will be used by the NPA to bring all of those involved in the corruption on our arms deal to face justice.
All right, so you've given us a clue about what you think should happen now, because clearly, another inquiry is probably not affordable or useful, given how long ago these things happened, but also that people need justice and quite swiftly. I wonder your thoughts. President Jacob Zuma, I think, had raised this inquiry as part of his defense. This will be a problem for him.
Absolutely. He now won't be able to use the report of the Seriti Commission as part of his defense, because that report has been set aside. In other words, it has absolutely no standing. In terms of your earlier comment, I agree entirely that it would be inappropriate to start another investigation given the massive cost of this effectively fruitless investigation now by the Seriti Commission. That's why I think what we need to happen is that the National Prosecuting Authority, which has access to all of the evidence, to all of the evidentiary documents, now needs to make decisions under its new leadership as to others besides former President Jacob Zuma and the French defense company Thales, that was then known as Thomson CSF, needs to now make decisions about who else should be put on trial and face prosecution for their role in corruption in the arms deal. I think that is the only way forward for South Africa, and the reason that I think it is an important way forward is primarily because there is also, in each of the arms deal contracts, there are clauses that shows that if people are convicted of corruption in relation to those contracts can, even this many years down the line, can be declared null and void, and some of the monies can be recouped by the state of South Africa. And I think this should now be our objectives, to make clear that the public are aware of exactly who was involved in the corruption, and that we try and recoup whatever monies from these contracts that we possibly can.
All right, so for the next coming days, South Africans will be looking towards Judge Seriti to see if he comments, that he comes back from this. But I wonder, as you were watching this case unfold, this commission unfold, do you think that his actions were deliberate, or do you think it was just poor judgment in the end?
Unfortunately, Peter, my conclusion has to be that his actions were deliberate. What do I base that on? I base that on the fact that a number of people who worked for the commission resigned and stated publicly that the commission's intention from the outset seemed to be to ensure that they found no evidence of corruption in the arms deal, and that they discredited the so-called critics of the arms deal. People like myself and many others who I know you've been interviewing today, who have stated for many, many years now that there is prima facie and significant prima facie evidence of corruption. So it is my contention that the Commission actually set itself up to find absolutely no corruption. And I think given the content and the nature of the judgment that has been agreed by a full bench of the North Gauteng High Court this morning, it would be extremely difficult for anyone, including Judge Seriti, to argue any different.
All right, Andrew Feinstein, we're going to leave it there. Thanks very, very much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us on this important judgment.